So now on to our guest. I am really excited. John and I have been working for a while to have this happen. He is a great voice. He's an extraordinary voice on NBC and MSNBC, and his podcast Impolitic is great. I've loved diving much deeper than I even had before and learning about him and listening to all of his conversations. There's a wide variety of people, and his style and tone and knowledge just comes through, and it is really exciting. So John, I thank you so much for being here, and thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you for Jamie. Thanks for saying those nice things. You read it just like I wrote it, and I'm delighted to be here with this group.
So there's obviously a lot to talk about, a lot of critical issues, concerns. I think the number one thing that I want to talk about, and maybe the toughest thing that we're going to deal with, is there a way to save the NBA All-Star game?
Huh. I was at All-Star Weekend this weekend, amazingly, and it's the first time I've ever gone, and I never had any interest before, and I went this time for business reasons, and I don't think so. No, I think it's not savable. It was interesting talking to Adrian Wojnarowski on the podcast the other day about this, and kind of thinking about how the function of All-Star games has changed over time, like because of media, basically, right? There were it was a platform. You think it's amazing to me that there, for all the young people anybody who's young enough on this Zoom, probably most people, it's the case that in our lifetime, during the era just immediately before the Showtime Lakers, that some of the NBA Finals games were broadcast on tape delay. They were not live. You could not watch the NBA Finals on live television. And so there were all these people, stars from minor market teams. The media exposure wasn't as great, and they used the All-Star games to, they really got exposure nationally and became and increased their economic value appreciably. Now it's just the stars are so rich, and the injury risk is so great that no one wants to expend any effort, and they get nothing out of it because of the ubiquity of media. There's no one who's in the league who's any good, there's no one in the league who's not known everywhere all the time. It's constantly on television of one form or other, or on social media. So I think it's slightly less ridiculous than the Pro Bowl, which is easily the most ridiculous pro sports All-Star game. But I don't think it's savable.
I sadly think I agree with you. All right. So I realize was not number one on everybody's topic, but I did.
No, if that was the hardest question we had for the day, that'd be really delightful.
We could save the All-Star game. We can have peace in the Middle East. So, I mean, there's so many topics we can cover. I want to kind of run through a little bit of rapid fire, which we can kind of get some quick answers and then go back to certain issues. But I want to sort of, they have this idea of people shouldn't be chasing squirrels these days. And should we, what do we focus on? What do we not focus on? I'd like to run through just a handful of things. And I'd love you to kind of say either if you think that's a good thing that's been done since Trump's been to office, a bad thing, or if it's sort of a squirrel. And I don't mean this glibly, but I think it's the only way to sort of process things for me. And a lot of this comes from how I'm thinking about things and processing things. So I'm going to be, okay, Gulf of America.
Well, clearly noise, not signal. I think of it that way. There for a little while, there was this kind of, I don't mean to break your rapid fire, but
right.
For a little while, there was this kind of should we pay attention to what Trump says or what he does? And that was actually, I don't think, totally not useful. It's slightly useful in the sense that Trump says a lot of things that he doesn't do anything about. But it's also the case that most of the things he does, he says he's going to do them first. So you can't quite follow that. That's not the right prism. I think the right prism is that the biggest challenge we all face is distinguishing signal and noise. And the Gulf of America thing is clearly noise in the sense that it's meaningless, but it's now become connected to, because of the challenge that he's waging against the Associated Press and having kicked them, essentially banned them from being able to do their jobs in the White House after over 100 years of being, one of the founding members of the White House press pool. It's now become more signal just because of that. It's truly one of the most Orwellian things I've seen in a while, is to have the press secretary standing up there saying, it is now a fact that this is the Gulf of America. Therefore, these reporters are not reporting facts. And if you don't report facts, we reserve the right to kick you out of kick you off of Air Force One. I mean, it seems like a crazy thing that small fight. There's always fights about access in every White House with reporters, but that has sort of become, at least it's become the proximate cause of something that is signal, not noise. But the actual thing itself, I think, is noise.
Okay. Eliminating paper straws.
Definitely noise, but I'm for it.
So okay, so we're gonna go.
Maybe the one thing that Trump has done is maybe the one thing that Trump has done in the first 4 weeks in office that I hardly approve of, unequivocally.
So we're gonna go with good, bad, or squirrel or noise. That's what we're gonna try to do here.
Right.
So
okay.
we're putting that as good. Okay, great.
Good.
Mara Gaza, or Trump's desire to take over Gaza and build condos.
Provisionally for now, noise. Like when there's funding for it, or military for it, whether either personnel or money is put towards it, I will no longer consider it noise. Until then, it's noise.
So let me ask you a question when it comes to that. So, and this becomes a much larger Trump issue in my mind, which is it feels like noise in many ways, and just sort of Trump making a kind of big brash statement like he likes to do. But obviously, there's a large group of people who make them very angry, and
Yes.
and beyond angry, and this is my concern for me personally about Trump when it comes to the international community. When we talk about this kind of idea of the ugly American, and that gets into USAID, but this idea that the ugly American is not a good thing across the world. Like, we don't need people to hate us. It doesn't benefit anybody. And I can think of a lot of people in that region by Trump sort of glibly saying, oh, we're just going to take over Gaza and we're just going to move all the people out and whatnot. That makes a lot of enemies. So
I don't disagree, and I think, I mean, this is why some of these categories are a little bit too coarse. Trump says things that have, by that standard, by the standard of Trump, if Trump says something that has some ripple effect somewhere in the world, potentially being negative, then there are a lot of things you have to recategorize and take them out of the noise category. I think it's more. There's one thing is kind of like, what are we going to pay attention to? So it's like, what's the purpose of the designation? Are we going to devote mental resources to focusing on a thing that is very likely, again, I say provisionally because who knows? I mean, Trump might actually try to do it. Until then, are you going to expend mental resources on a thing that is primarily done? I think you're right when you call it glib or off the cuff, totally not seriously considered, not serious, with no real apparent intention that we can tell so far to follow through on it. How much time do you want to spend of your very limited mental resources, at least if you're me, when there's 5,000 things going on? That's the kind of point of distinguishing between signal and noise to me. And I agree with you. There are many things, Trump, that are purely rhetorical that can have real world consequences. But the amount of time I want to spend thinking about them is relatively limited, given that Trump's doing so much stuff that has real world consequences, like right now today, and that are where they're potentially changing the nature of the American constitutional order before our eyes.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And what we want to spend our mental resources focused on is really, to me, I think the most important thing, and what we want to roll up our sleeves and fight back upon.
Yes,
versus
that's right.
One of the things that I think a month ago would have been sort of an easier question is really kind of this concept of DOGE, and the concept of having an agency that's set up to go in and sort of find government waste, because I think any rational person would say, great, I want to find as much government waste as humanly possible. And I don't know really any administration that hasn't wanted to do that.
Right.
Maybe they haven't been effective. So this one's sort of a bit harder, right? But where do you?
It's definitely bad and definitely signal at this point. I mean, I think a month ago, before Donald Trump was president, And I would say in the month when he first appointed the committee, DOGE still, it's not really clear what it is. It's not clear that it has any actual legal standing. It's not clear that any of these people are authorized to do anything, have any actual legal justification for doing anything they're doing. But when they announced it, and they did the first day where we still, so long ago that Vivek Ramaswamy was still part of it then, it was, I think, people who had covered Washington for any period of time thought two things. One was that their whole careers, people have been talking about, Republican, Democrat alike have appointed commissions to look into the questions of waste, fraud, and abuse in government. And that it's like apple pie, right? It's a thing that to your point, no one, Democrat or Republican alike, but nobody stands up and argues in favor of waste, fraud, and abuse. And most people would like to actually believe that there is some of that. There is some waste, there is some fraud, there is some abuse in the government. The second thing that most people who cover Washington had seen these commissions in the past would say is that find as much of it as you can, and you're not going to move the needle on what this is ostensibly about, which is trying to reduce the size and scope of government and bring down the deficit, bring down the debt, make any kind of a dent in that. 85% of the money that America spends every year goes for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, debt and service on the national debt and defense. That's it. That's 85%. And every one of these commissions comes in and says, we're going to find all the waste, fraud, and abuse. And they find some amount of waste, fraud, and abuse, and then look up and go, whoa, that's 85% of the budget every year. That's untouchable. And so we are kind of, screaming in the wind when we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. Very popular, maybe wins you some points with some voters, but doesn't really have any material effect. What DOGE has now become is this vehicle by which the richest person on planet Earth is doing things like accessing the Treasury Department's payment systems and, as of today, accessing the IRS, your tax records. We have no idea. I can't even be apocalyptic about it because we don't know what they're accessing. We don't know how much they're having access to. We don't know for what purpose. All we know is that people who have no legislative, legal, constitutional mandate have now been dropping into the core data of what everyone would have agreed, certainly, I would say 6 months ago, let alone 6 years ago, was highly sensitive data that most people on this call aren't super comfortable with anybody having access to who's not authorized to. So, and the purpose of it is also much clearer, as it's been clear that Trump has given it the degree of authority it has and the degree of autonomy that it has, and has not, the marriage between him and Elon Musk, which I think will prove to be not permanent, but will prove to be more durable for a variety of reasons we can talk about than people think. It is clear that it's an instrument to the larger purpose, which is on what the only thing that Steve Bannon and Elon Musk really agree about, which is what they would call the deconstruction of the administrative state, which others would say is basically trying to tear the government down to the studs, and shifting power to the executive away from the normal balance of powers between the three branches of government. The executive, there have been a variety of presidents in our lifetime who have thought the executive should have more power. We've never seen an executive unilaterally testing the bounds of what it's allowed to do without any kind of pushback from or authorization from on the other side from Congress. And that kind of expansion of legislative power, when put to the purposes of tearing the government down to the studs, is a threat to the constitutional order and is super dangerous. I will quote from the headline that I have seen most recently that has most captured the essence of this, both in its horror and in its humor. I mean, it's an Onion headline. On Saturday, the first headline I saw of this, probably because of where I work, was an NBC News story. The headline of which was, Trump administration wants to unfire nuclear safety workers, but can't figure out how to reach them. That was the headline. So they had decided, in a totally arbitrary way, had fired most of the people who do nuclear safety in the government. And once they cut them off their emails, had no way, once they realized they'd done this thing that threatened the safety of the nuclear infrastructure in the country, we're like, we want those people back, but we can't reach them because they've all been cut off of their government email, and we can't hire them back even if we want to. That is both appalling, like genuinely appalling, and also like kind of funny. I mean, it is an Onion headline from another era. So yeah, DOGE, signal and bad.
It really is an Onion headline. It's not funny in the slightest bit. Since you brought it up, and I have my own ideas on this, but why do you think the Trump-Musk relationship doesn't go up in smoke like most people thought originally?
Well, I mean, I think that, we all operate on the basis of precedent, right? We look at past patterns, and on the basis of past patterns, there's no relationship that Donald Trump has ever carried on where the person he's engaged with starts to rival him in terms of his public profile, starts to take away any of the headlines from Trump, or even worse in Trump's mind, kind of starts to profit in some ways off of Trump. That ever survives. It's never survived. I think Musk is in a different category for two reasons. They're both instrumental. One is that they're both assets that he brings, things that he puts on the table that no one else has ever brought into Trump's orbit. One of them is as a purely functional matter. He says, I have $250 million and I'll use it to primary anyone who steps out of line. The threat of primaries that Trump has wielded throughout his time in office, both in the first term, in his time out of office, and now, the threat of primarying Republicans is the primary instrument of obedience that he brings to bear on the Republican Party in Congress. We can have a whole separate conversation about why anybody cares enough. I mean, what's so great about it? Like, I understand if someone threatens your children, like why you would knuckle under them. If the worst thing that could happen to you is lose a primary and you don't get to be in the House anymore, I mean, anybody who knows anything about what it's like to be a member of the House of Representatives would be like, what's so great about this job that's going to scare you? But it does for a variety of reasons. And having them not just threatening those Republicans implicitly and explicitly, as they did with Joni Ernst over the Pete Hegseth thing, is one thing for him to threaten them with the loyalty of his voters. It's another thing to threaten them with the loyalty of his voters and with Elon Musk's bank account, something Trump's never had to wield before. And that serves his purposes. And the second is Twitter or X. No one's ever walked into the room with a $250 million that they're willing to spend or more, effectively an unlimited bankroll that they could spend on his behalf. And what has become the most important social media platform in his world. That a social media platform it's important in all of our worlds in a sense, because it is an instrument for misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, but also is the primary now tool by which Trump can communicate with his base. And the fact that Musk controls that platform gives him a degree of, along with that checkbook, gives him a kind of traction and sway and utility to Trump that no one else has ever offered Trump before. I do think there will come a moment when it will break up. The laws of psychological physics will kick back in, but I do think Trump will see it as he'll be willing to tolerate a lot more, and already has tolerated a lot more from Elon Musk than he's ever tolerated from anybody else who's encroached on his space in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the money issue is really the thing. I mean, I agree with you on X, but you know, Musk loses or makes on a daily basis more than we'll spend in an entire election cycle.
Sure.
And it's hard for Trump to lose that. But
It's a crazy, I mean, you know, and I think, we will look back one day on this, and I say this even to, I mean, if not to the most hardline pro MAGA people, but erstwhile Republicans, just from the moment the day after the election, when all of a sudden it's a movie scenario. You guys a lot of you people are Hollywood people. I'd say, the world's richest man on the day after the election, who the guy who he supported in this very extravagant way, and unexpected way, suddenly shows up at his house and is like in Mar-a-Lago, sitting in all the meetings where the president's calling foreign leaders for his first phone calls after getting elected. That is a wild, a scenario that you couldn't put it in a Hollywood script pre-Trump and not have somebody laugh you out of the room. And now, here it is.
Yeah. We'll see if his ego or his sort of long-term, holding power is more important. Because at the end of the day, listen, he's going to be president, for till the end of this term, assuming he makes the whole term, regardless of whether Musk is supporting him or not, and whether or not he's not using the tools of government regardless. I mean, that's what, and you've talked a lot about this as of other people. He's trying to pass things in executive orders or executive memos. He's not using the fact that they control all three, the House forms of government right now. So does it even matter if they win or don't win? And he doesn't really care about passing things through Congress, right?
Right. They're gonna get to a place where everything to everything, there's a season, right? And there are things that, at least in our currently constituted form of the American government, that he's going to need to pass through Congress. For instance, tax cuts, which he wants very much. The question of how there is going to come a moment when he has to rely on Congress. It does seem like right now what he's been trying to do is, in the period of time before we get to that day, to maximize this period and do as much as possible and push as many limits as possible, knowing that the courts are going to push back some of them, and see what happens. And not to get too far ahead of the conversation here, but one version of that is he accepts the court. Ultimately, he pushes all these things into the courts. He gets rebuffed, as he has been in a lot of courts. He repeals as many of those as possible, pushes as many as possible into what he thinks is a very friendly venue in the form of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules. And if he loses and decides to abide by that ruling, he will win some of these cases. And whatever he wins, he's gained that ground. And whatever he's lost, who cares? The other scenario, of course, is the scenario that many people have been contemplating of late, which is what happens if he starts to say, if John Roberts and 5 or 6 Supreme Court justices, for instance, on birthright citizenship, which even this court is likely to rule against Trump on, and they rule against him. Does Trump? What happens when Trump says, "Well, Supreme Court can come up here and try to enforce that"? We're doing what we're doing. Fuck the Supreme Court, which is a thing that most people in the worlds of law and politics are now contemplating in a pretty serious way, given things that J.D. Vance has said publicly, and that Trump, who's kind of said, we follow the courts, but as usual, he's not unequivocal about that. And even if he was unequivocal, the day will come when we'll see whether he will test that particular boundary between the courts and the executive branch. And that is the day, if they decide to reject a Supreme Court ruling. That will be the day when we will have no ambiguity about the fact that we are full on in a real constitutional crisis. You can debate whether we are now, but you won't be able to debate it then.
I'm gonna do a quick poll just on topics to make sure we're covering what you guys want us to focus on and cover, and we're gonna leave some time at the end for questions. I'm gonna thank you for participating in the lightning round. I'm not sure if it worked the way I had it in my mind, but it was a good attempt. And it's very hard, I think, to really just do these and flippantly say good or bad. So I knew I was, I didn't even get to talk about the penny. We didn't get to talk about,
I'm for getting rid of the penny. I think that's good too.
I'm for the penny, the nickel, the dime. I'm for it all. Get rid of it all.
When I saw when I saw some reporting someplace about the fact that pennies, nickels, and dimes all cost more to make than they're worth, I'm right to get rid of those. I frankly could get rid of all the coins. Like, I don't really, I'd be good with, some paper money and electronic. That'd be good with me. But certainly pennies, nickels, and dimes.
The nickel, they say, costs 13 cents to produce. You talk about government waste. That's all we should be focused on.
That's the one. Maybe the only thing that Trump has done, getting rid of the penny. Maybe the only thing where there's been an overlap between things Trump is for and things the West Wing was for. It's like the Aaron Sorkin, Donald Trump overlap. It's exactly one issue that the penny should.
Yeah. Let's talk about this idea of a coup or coup d'etat, for another term. You had Lawrence Tribe on. That was great. Lawrence Tribe said very clearly that this is a coup. And then you had Ezra Klein on, who said this is not a coup. So first question, and to be clear, the definition of a coup is a sudden, violent, unlawful seizure of power from a government. So that's coup. So in your mind right now, where are we on the coup meter? I guess, lack of really, not to be light about it.
Yeah. I think that there is, the Wall Street Journal the Wall Street Journal op-ed page or the editorial board did an editorial the other day arguing against this notion, not surprisingly, but in some of the things they argued for why it's not, I encourage people to read the article, because that wasn't a crazy Wall Street Journal editorial, but some of those things were, I thought, tendentious, some of the arguments they made, but they did make this one point at the end that I am in sympathy with, which is, that and I think this is what Ezra's point was too, was that kind of, on some level, crying coup at this stage, is a bullet spent from the chamber, so to speak, rhetorically, that we may very well need, and that using it too soon may be counterproductive in some ways. I am, but I will say these kinds of questions, are we in a coup? It's kind of question I never really contemplated. I'd have to consider as someone who's been writing about American politics since 1990 and expected to be doing it for the rest of my life. So it's hard to wager. I will say that, Timothy Snyder, a great scholar of authoritarianism and autocracy at Yale, did a thing, did a piece recently in which he said, if Elon Musk rolled up in front of the Treasury Department in a cyber truck with a bunch of fascist banners on the side and a bunch of guys got out with Kalashnikovs and broke in and accessed the Treasury Department's computer systems, you would say that's a coup. Everyone would look at that and say that's a coup d'etat. What's the difference in our modern world between a Kalashnikov and a zip drive? The fact that these are effectively the same thing. And I think that's an intellectually compelling point of view. So I'm not going to give you a good answer as like I'm not the ultimately, thank God, the Grandmaster General or the Grandmaster Flash of coup distinctions. But I do think the general point that there are things going on that I sometimes try to in order to avoid sounding like you're wildly catastrophizing. One of the helpful rubrics that I've found is to say to people, well, imagine if the following thing happened in Bulgaria or Zaire or Sri Lanka, and you were covering this foreign correspondent. What would you call it? What was the language you would use? And a good example of this in the same vein is, the decision to pardon the blanket pardon for January 6th offenders. If you let Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes, the people who were convicted for seditious conspiracy, who were like ringleaders of the January 6th riot, if you let those people out, if that happened in one of those other countries I mentioned, you would say the new strongman president has freed the paramilitaries. We don't talk about paramilitaries in America because we've never really had paramilitaries in our lifetimes. But that's what that is. You're letting you're freeing the paramilitaries, and that's what strongmen do. I think it's useful to think about a lot of these things through the lens of what would you say if it happened in Bolivia. And there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the last month that puts you in the category of, if not coup, of classic authoritarian and autocratic tactics of a rising strongman who's trying to effectively subvert or overcome democratic norms and constitutional principles.
Yeah, listen, the example you use of the Cybertruck with zip drives versus weapons. I mean, the definition of coup has been militarily violent.
Yeah.
But we are living in a new world, and but as Riss said, if we really believe it's a coup, then we all got to get off this Zoom and get to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the goals, I mean, I've criticized myself for maybe not being as open to people coming from different perspectives and different viewpoints. And I really want to strive to work harder to, engage people who voted for Donald Trump and try and understand what I'm missing or what I was missing. And I think from a macro standpoint, I get it at this point. Like I'm very clear why Donald Trump won, and I can't, deny or argue with a lot of people why they voted in the end the way they did. But at the same time, when you're engaging with somebody who is coming from a conservative standpoint or a Trump supporter, what kind of tools do you use, or how are you able to kind of, when they say, oh, well, defend the January 6th pardons, for example, you just use as an example.
Yeah.
Is there tools you use to be able to, and I'm not insinuating who you voted for,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
how do you kind of have those conversations? I mean, yeah.
I mean, Jamie, I've been having them for a long time now, and it's funny because there's different strategies in different conversations with different kinds of people. To be honest, I mean, in the 8 years that we made the circus and made 150 episodes of that show, that period of time, I traveled almost every year to at least like 30 states and talked to a lot of people across the spectrum. I remember doing a focus group in 2015, in the summer of 2015 in New Hampshire with undecided Republican voters, at a time when Jeb Bush was supposed to be the Republican frontrunner. Trump had just gotten in the race, and we sat in this room with a dozen or 16 undecided Republican voters, and none of them were going to vote for Jeb Bush, and all of them were at least open to voting for Trump. And it was the first time I ever heard people say, he's one of us, he's a blue collar billionaire. And what they did in that room was do a thing that I had heard people talk about seeing in focus groups for people like Barack Obama, where even people who weren't for him in their early in their rise would make when they were presented with contrary information that should have made them not like him, like, did you know Donald Trump was once for national health care? Do you know he once wanted to legalize drugs? Do you know he gave money to Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer? They would find excuses. Their instinct was to try to find a way to excuse what it was. And that's a powerful thing in politics when you have that going for you with voters. And a lot of those people said things that I then have heard for the last 10 years, which is something along the lines of, I don't like that he's racist. I don't like that he's a misogynist. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like the tweets. I don't like the cruelty. I don't like this, that, and the other thing. But here's what I like. I think that every other politician that I see is a fraud, and they won't tell you what they really think. They're telling you what they think you want to hear, or what they, and he, in a way, his racism or his misogyny or whatever, talking about Mexicans coming across with carrying drugs and they're rapists, was like a credential of his authenticity, and that people who are really hungry for authenticity. That's not everybody in the Trump movement, but that was the beginning of my realizing that Trump was like a different kind of phenomenon. And now, it is, there's a whole bunch of people in the pro-Trump movement who there is no strategy to really have a conversation, because they just believe, that they effectively believe that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. I mean, it's they don't believe, they believe that January 6th was the day at the park, and that this was all a setup, and the FBI, it was a false flag operation. They have a million things. You can't really talk your way through the conspiracy theorists and the people who are, I would say, living in an alternate reality. I would say not reality, but an alternate reality. It's a different conversation to have. I'll give you a very good example of the kind of thing you confront all the time is, Reince Priebus over the weekend was on one of the Sunday shows, and someone confronted him, asked him about this. Trump had just tweeted out this Napoleon quote, supposedly a Napoleon quote, we're not really sure, but he who saves his country does not violate any law, which for many people is a kind of shocking thing to say. Maybe one of the most kind of obviously flagrantly kind of unconstitutional anti-rule of law things that any elected president's ever said. And Reince Priebus is like, he says these things to piss you off. He's just trolling you. And that is the attitude of a lot of rich Republicans that I know, who decided they hated Kamala Harris. They thought that Biden was terrible. And when you would confront them with things like January 6th or things like that, their attitude was, he says all this stuff, but he's not going to do those things. We're not going to have a trade war. These things, he's not going to follow through on these things. And sometimes they've been right. But increasingly, you look at a lot of the things that Trump is doing, and you have to say to people, well, let's talk through. I will occasionally say to people, can I tell you about Michael Fanone, the police officer who was off duty on January 6th and decided to go up to the Capitol because it was being overrun by people, and got beaten, tased, beaten with flagpoles, multiple tased, had 2 heart attacks, suffered brain damage from it, by a guy who had written on a message board 2 weeks earlier, I'm bringing my tasers to Washington. That guy got convicted. This cop who volunteered to try to do what he could to preserve order at the Capitol ended up bludgeoned. They were talking about stripping his gun from him and shooting him. Again, had brain damage, everything else in the world. That guy, who was sentenced to 16 years in prison, served about 11 months. And the idea that the president blithely just said, I'm going to put that person back on the street. I mean, it's truly, I don't mean to be maudlin about it, but it's like truly one of the most shocking, morally shocking things that I've ever, in my lifetime, covering politics. I mean, of anybody in American government. There have been some pretty terrible things that have happened in America, and you can talk about systemic things and individual things. But that, it just doesn't compute for me that someone could be for that. And there is a cognitive dissonance. You only get so far in the conversation before people start to say, you just hate Trump. And I'm like, I don't feel deranged. I feel like I would have said that about any president I've ever covered if they had pardoned someone who had done something like that. So there's a limit. I've come after 10 years of having conversations with Trump supporters. I've come to the point where it's starting to feel like it's not worth the time to deploy the tactics Journalistically, if I'm doing a story about it, it's one thing, but just in terms of my general life, I don't know. What about you? When you run into rich people out there who voted for Trump, what do you do?
I'm trying really hard to engage in conversation and dialogue, and I'm across the board, when it comes to some of the war on DEI now, when it comes to Trump, I'm really working hard and spending a lot of time on listening to what people have to say, no matter what it is, and trying to find facts, wherever facts, you can get facts today, which you can if you corroborate a couple different sources, but it takes a lot of work. I mean, and I am then going back to people and saying, hey, you said this. I went back and I did my research, and this is what
Yeah.
I found. So now help me understand what your point was. And some people engage in the conversation. It just goes circular and it gets nowhere. Some
Right.
people, I have one person who will remain nameless, who just every third response just says MAGA. Like that's just like their answer. I have
Yeah.
other people who just on their every third response say, well, Donald Trump won and the people voted. And, okay, like, how bad is RFK or Tulsi Gabbard or Pete Hegseth? Like, oh, don't worry, they're not that bad. Well, it's like, no, they're pretty bad. Like they're, if you were hiring people for their job, they wouldn't even get past the first round of interviews. So don't tell me they're not bad. Well, he won, so he should be able to have his people. And it's like, well, that's not how government really works. Like that's not, people are just afraid to vote against him right now, and that becomes the issue. As I said earlier, I'm trying really hard to find some conservative Republican leaders and candidates who I can hopefully engage in a conversation about. But if we can't get the police report straight, right? If we can't say, Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, if we can't say partnering those types of people was bad, um, then I have a tough time then having a further conversation. It's like if we can't
Yeah.
start at the same baseline, yeah, listen, the Biden's pardon, of Hunter and whatnot, yeah, those weren't great, but it's not the same level of pardoning the criminals that were did everything against what Trump you'd think would stand for. I mean, it's just not.
And I think it's just, the no, Donald Trump is an extraordinary political force. I mean, and the fact is, I said on election night, and I've said ever since, I'm glad he won the popular vote. If he was going to win, I'd rather have him win the popular vote than have won another election where people said it was somehow illegitimate because he got in through the electoral college backdoor or whatever. It's like, let's face who we are and the fact that Trump has been someone who's commanded the support of in successful elections of north of 80 million Americans. Like this is a person with a large, powerful constituency who's gotten more popular as he's done the things he's done over the course of this period of time. It was good for, I think, the country and people who oppose him to have to face the reality of his popularity. It is still the case that he did not win in a landslide. This is another argument you get into all day long. I'm like, guys, I can rattle off, I can tell you, what a landslide looks like. I've seen them starting with Reagan in 1984, is what it's like to win 500 electoral votes and what it's like to win 58 or 59% of the popular vote. Someone who wins 49.5% and wins a totally legitimate and respectable win in the electoral college is just not a landslide by any recent historic standards. It's just not even as you go back as far as the Obama 12 election, which was not a landslide. But that's, these are again facts you can get into arguments with. But I think when people say, well, this is what people voted for, that just doesn't, I mean, that makes no sense to anybody who covers politics or thinks about how people vote, because people vote for a lot of reasons and issues. There are many, many people who vote for many presidents on both sides of the aisle who disagree with them about many things, but agree with them about the things that matter to them most. And in this election, I think probably you would say, Jamie, if you talk to people, there are a ton of people who thought, again, you can argue with them all day long about the facts of the case, but the reality is they're like, my economic standing felt better under Trump than it felt under Biden, and the Biden inflation was too high, and I didn't like some of these woke/DEI policies, whatever they are, and I just was ready. And I like the vibes of Trump. I like the patriotism. I like whatever. But these people were not signing off. I mean, Trump made, I think, something like 2,000 different campaign promises. People were not endorsing all of those. They just weren't. But many of them have no idea what those things are. And when he's doing them now, people are saying, like, I mean, even if they're not protesting, they're kind of like, I didn't vote for that. None of these people cast a vote on whether USAID should be shut down. That's just, it's kind of ludicrous. So this is where we get into the questions of what's so dysfunctional about this era, which is that Republicans in the House and Senate have decided for the first time, in my lifetime and probably ever, where congressional majorities have decided that they are willing to be fully subjugated to the executive branch and will just do whatever the executive branch says and wants. That is not, how the constitutional design was, that the institutional imperative of Congress, that they would, for their own reasons of like wanting their own power, that they would push back against the executive and insist on an equal voice. Or something akin to an equal voice, and not seeing and having, it's the combination of those two things. It's Trump's agenda in combination with the way in which the Republican Party has become entirely supine that puts us where we are right now. And that's why we get things like, well, he won the election, so he can do whatever he wants. It's like, well, again, to your point, that's not really how it was supposed to work. And it's not how it's ever really worked previously in our lifetimes.
Yeah. All right, we're rounding through. We still have a lot to get through. You talked about how Robert Garcia, his calling of Elon a dick and using kind of profanity. You dabble in profanity on your podcast. Do you feel
love profanity? Love profanity.
Do you feel that the Democrats across the board need to kind of step up and need more attitude and need more? I mean, I hate to say just profanity. I actually had talked to a couple of very high-powered, elected officials in the Democratic Party, and who like to curse offline, and I was like, you need to do that more in public, and they were like, I can't. Last time I did it, I got eviscerated, and I was like, I don't agree.
Yes, I mean, I think that anything that makes politicians sound like human beings and not like automatons is good. I think authenticity is the coin of the realm, and I think for part of the reason why we see the rise of these unconventional politicians, not just Trump, but going back, people who had strong appeal in various ways, because they were willing to basically say, I'm going to speak in a language that more people relate to. So I'm for that. And Garcia calling Elon Musk a dick, I think, was emotionally very satisfying for a lot of Democrats. I don't think it comes anywhere close to solving the problem. But I do think it, in a weird way, it doesn't solve, by which I mean solves the problem of the Democratic Party reclaiming its place as a competitive national political party, and certainly not towards the larger goals of like figuring out what the Democratic Party should be about in this era, and how it gets back to being, if it still wants to be the party of working America, which is what it was founded to be and was for decades, most of its modern life. How do you get back there? Right now, most dudes in America, like, just I'm not talking about just young dudes. I'm just talking about men in general. Like, there are men who will vote for Democrats, clearly, and many of them looked at Donald Trump and said, I'll vote for anybody against Donald Trump. I'd vote for a brain and a fat over Donald Trump. But like, the Democrats have a big problem with working Americans who talk, the language of working America, and particularly with men who look at the party broadly and go, I hate to use the words like beta and cuck, but that is like the response you get. A lot of men, that like the Democratic Party's problem with men, and especially young men, but men of color on the younger side, it's deep. And anybody you meet a lot of Democratic men who vote for Democrats, but not with a lot of enthusiasm, and don't see like, who don't see an image of whatever their image of their idealized image of masculinity is. They don't see the Democratic Party. And that's been a huge problem for Democrats. And these two problems with men and with working people are big issues. And I think speaking real talk, #RealTalk, is the first gambit to getting in the door of starting to fix those larger problems, but it's really only the first gambit.
Yeah. Sort of
yes, whoever's sending a message that says these are sweeping generalizations, that's what you get on a Zoom. If you'd like to have a data dump on to support some of these, I'd be happy to do it with you offline. But you get sweeping generalizations when you do a Zoom like this. And yes, I don't know if Westmore can bring the party together, but he's a particular person I've thought about. I can't pay attention to all of those things coming out on the chat line. Not mean to be rude to people, but occasionally something pops up. Wes Moore's a good example of a guy. I've known Wes Moore for a long time, and forget about anything else. You could have a conversation with Wes Moore where here's a guy who's a military veteran, was a wide receiver in college, who speaks the language of football, hip hop, and policy with like equal. And Obama, frankly, was someone who could do that also, who could be in Rick Warren's mega church on the couch with Oprah Winfrey and at the 50-yard line of the Super Bowl. And he was equally comfortable in all those places and seemed not out of place there. Wes Moore is someone like that. There are other people out there like that. They're not the only person, but it's kind of an instructive example to point to of the kind of thing Democrats have to recapture, because the notion of that the party is out of touch coastal cultural elites. That is a stereotype for sure, and not 100% true about all Democrats or anything else. But that is the thing that, when it gets hung around your neck, is a big millstone, and also a millstone that can keep you for a very long time in a minority position in American politics.
You brought up Wes Moore. I've said time and time again that I think one of the things that gets me excited as a Democrat is that the bench is deeper than it's ever been in my lifetime. And when you talk about Wes Moore, and you talk about Gretchen Whitmer, and you talk about Josh Shapiro, say what you want about Gavin Newsom, but he's good to spar with Trump at a bare minimum. Do you agree that the bench for the Democrats is deep? And who, besides Wes Moore, just out of curiosity, do you think is exciting or interesting or piques your curiosity?
I think you named a bunch of them there. I think Wes Moore, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer are all. I mean, if you're thinking of that, I'll back into one thing to say the way the Democratic Party is gonna find its footing. It's very hard. I can criticize Democrats all day long, but I will say, when you are in control of nothing, like when you don't have, when Trump was president, Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. Nancy Pelosi could be the leader of the Democratic Party because she ran the House of Representatives and there was actual power there. When you control no branch of government, and there's nothing to really, it's hard to get traction and elevate. And it's always people who redefine a party, whether it's Bill Clinton redefining Democrats in the late 80s, early 90s, or Obama in his era. So we have a ways to go. We're going to have midterm elections, but really until the presidential race starts to take shape, you're not going to have, kind of what does the new voice of the Democratic Party sound like? But those people that we just mentioned, Wes Moore, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin is someone who, for whatever, take for whatever it's worth, is someone who Trump has always regarded as formidable because of the fact that he's willing to fight he's a fighter. A friend of mine said at one point, a female friend of mine who said to me, Gavin Newsom is a fucking monster, but he might be the monster we need. And that's the way people think about Trump on the Republican side. There's a lot of things I don't like about him, but he crushes those liberals. Well, there's some things to say about Gavin Newsom in that context. Again, I'm not coming down in favor of anybody. I'm just saying they all have these kind of qualities. There is, I would say, the best communicator in the Democratic Party is Pete Buttigieg, and is a formidable person in his own right. He has certain challenges in the cultural milieu for sure, but those challenges, I think, get less and less every year that goes by. The ones that relate to him being gay. Steve Beshear is an impressive guy. There are a bunch of them, and don't sleep on AOC, who is someone who is really, of all of those people, the only Democrat who is fluent in Gen Z, in being able to play in social media and could go anywhere. You could put AOC in a room with Joe Rogan. This is one of my tests these days, which is like, can a Democrat go on Joe Rogan and sit there for 2.5 hours and do fine? She could do fine. And again, I'm not endorsing her. You might not like her policies. You might think she's too far left, whatever, too progressive. These are people who should be in the arena trying to hammer out what the party stands for and who should lead it. And all those people are formidable political performers. And that's a not unimportant thing ever, but particularly in this day and age.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up AOC. I genuinely believe that her veering towards the center is going to continue, and you look around in 5 years, and you're not going to even recognize who she is. And I don't mean that as a criticism to her. I think she's, just learning and growing and changing. I don't believe that her policy.
Not only is it not a criticism, I think it's a commendation. It's like the fact that she's not that she's moderating, but just that some of those women in the squad, I will say, are very content to be minority voices. Not minority, I don't mean ethnic minority. I mean they're fine being in opposition for the rest of their lives. And she wants power. She wants to run She wants to run shit. And that's, you need that if you're going to lead a party.
All right, a couple minutes left. You got to skirt my role playing for you to pretend like you were Ken Martin and you're now the head of the DNC. So we don't have time for that. So you got to pass on that.
Thank God.
Jim Vandehei said to me last summer that in his mind, if Trump, was not running for the Republican nominee anymore, it was more likely to be Tucker Carlson up next than Marco Rubio or your traditional Republican.
100%.
100%.
100%. Yes.
And who else do you?
I would say that I think that I want to be really careful when I say these words, okay? Because everyone's going to lose their minds. But Marjorie Taylor Greene is Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump Jr., or Tucker Carlson are more likely nominees of the party than any sitting senator or anybody who's an elected, who holds a serious elected post in the United States Senate or a gubernatorial position in the Republican Party. That is, they're more likely. I'm not saying, I want to be clear, I'm not saying Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be the Republican nominee, but if you put Marjorie Taylor Greene up against Nikki Haley, and that was a one-on-one in the Republican Party right now, Marjorie Taylor Greene would beat Nikki Haley in 39 to 43 states in the Republican primary.
I was shocked that you just had, was it Robert Draper on, and he did his Charlie Kirk, piece and talked about it. And he said that he would rather have a drink with Marjorie Taylor Greene just because she likes to drink. But I can't think of anybody I would rather spend less time with than Marjorie Taylor Greene.
You say that, and my friend Jennifer Palmieri said that until she spent some time with Marjorie Taylor Greene for an episode of The Circus, and she came back. She didn't enjoy it, but she came back, and she's as liberal as they come. And she came back. She was like, there's something there. She has a very, this is like a little one of these inside tittle things. Reporters who cover her have constant text threads with her in which she is very knowing about, not that she's a fraud, that she's faking what she is in public, but she carries on private text conversations with reporters that are much more like what you would expect from a non-lunatic politician. She's more politically savvy and more speaks the language of like political operators more than foaming at the mouth right-wing lunacy than you would imagine in her private conversations with the press who cover her regularly.
All right, we're gonna finish up in less than 5 minutes, everybody. First thing, for just a funny note, as you are a diehard Wu-Tang Clan fan, what are your 3 favorite Wu-Tang Clan songs?
Well, I mean, the only fight really there. I mean, Cream is, I think, probably arguably the greatest, maybe the greatest. I mean, certainly in the top 5 all hip hop songs ever done by anybody ever. Protect Your Neck is my number 2, and I probably, I don't know. Could I go Wu-Tang solo? I mean, Bring the Ruckus probably is number 3 in my pantheon. These are all relatively predictable songs.
It's still fine. We're going to see how deep our Wu-Tang audience is here. Mikhail, that wasn't the right poll. Okay. So the one thing I really like to try and do here is leave with some action. And, I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now is people's heads are spinning, as we talked about. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to follow. They don't know what to focus on. They don't know where to put their energy towards. So, what would you leave this group with? And what would you, leave anybody with? Like, what can you get out and do today? Like, what's something that you think is valuable, that can make an impact, and that people should be focusing on?
Well, I mean, probably some decent, reasonable percentage of people on this Zoom live in the Los Angeles area, and my hometown, given the scale of the recovery efforts that are going to be necessary to rebuild the chunks of LA that got burned in the fires, there's their tending your garden in this case is a pretty urgent thing. So it's hard to tell LA people that they should go out and do other stuff. But in the first Trump term, we would lovingly but mockingly refer to like resistance moms, right? Who are these the women who would watch me all day on MSNBC and would have their resistance gold chains, and they were constantly, they watched cable news all day long, and people who had never watched cable news before now watch cable news all day long and waxed apocalyptic about how Trump was going to destroy the country. And I would always say to them, I would say, this isn't helping. I mean, it's not, I'm arguing against interest here. I like that our ratings are up, and I like that you're kind of learning some things about government that you didn't know before. But really, if you want to beat back Trumpism, there's only one way to do it, which is to win, and is to go out and start. There are congressional elections in 2 years. There are off-year elections a year from now. There are voters to register. There's doors to knock. There's things to do out there in the world. Why don't you stop watching cable TV and go out and do some work? Because, the most inspiring things that I've seen in the last few years have been, to this day, it's a marvel, right? That, Kansas, after the Dobbs decision, after Roe got repealed, the first state, one of the earliest states that tried to change its abortion restrictions was Kansas, a state where for 40 years, 2/3 to 70% of the country of the state said it was pro-life and wanted to ban abortion. And it turns out that a lot of people's answers on polls related to abortion were opinions expressed in the absence of any real threat that their right to reproductive freedom was going to be taken away. And they scheduled that vote in the summer of 2022 at a time when it was going to maximize conservative turnout. And no one thought there was any possibility that the amendment there that would effectively have made abortion illegal in Kansas would get knocked down. And not only did it fail, but it failed by a relatively easy vote, because organizers got into the state, went on the ground, got people, went and did the work. They went out there and found out that it was not a lost cause, and they could go out and get that work done. I think everybody has their passions about the things that they care about as issues, and everyone who's on this Zoom is probably the wrong people you're talking to, because they're people who are already interested enough to be on a Zoom like this. But I mean, the main thing I would say, I don't like to give advice about work on this or work on that. But I will say that the difference between 2017 and now is really striking, because what didn't happen was, we didn't see the pink women in pink hats. We haven't seen marches in the street. We haven't seen anything like that. And I totally understand it. People who had gone through not just 4, but 8 years, really, even the 4 years that Trump was out of office, in a posture of resistance and outrage and fear. When he won last November, a lot of those people, at least anecdotally, Jamie, I don't know if this is what your reaction, what you've heard from people, but anecdotally, I just had a lot of people who were like, I'm tired, like I'm exhausted. I want to go home and watch ESPN and, wake me when the next election comes. And the only thing I know right now with the same kind of certainty that I know that the sun does in fact rise in the east and set in the west, is that is the most completely natural and understandable reaction for anybody to want to just tune it out and stop watching TV and stop paying attention and tune out the news and wait till the next time there's an election. And that is exactly what they want. If you are trying to undermine or overthrow American democracy, that is another one of the classic things in the kind of authoritarian, autocratic toolkit, which is, flood the zone, try everything, confuse people, wear them down to the point where they just say, enough. I just want to watch TV. Call me next time I have a chance to vote, and I'll vote then. And, in some countries, that chance never really comes again.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to say my advice, which I guess is counter to everybody else's, is reach out to somebody who has a different perspective than you and try and engage in a conversation and try and get to the place of facts and try and go back and forth. It takes time. It's frustrating. It is, but I think it's important. And I think we need to do that every day to some extent, and you have to figure out where your line is of when you want to stop that conversation. But we need to figure out a way to get out there, get out to America, go to different states or cities, or have conversations with old friends who are in different places and have different perspectives, and just try and see what we're missing. And I put something in the chat, which was Rabbi Sharon Brous did a sermon last week where she talked about not being a snail. And I think that is also really important, and it's tough. And the attitude of sitting at home and watching reality TV or ESPN is obviously a lot more enjoyable and a lot easier, but democracy is hard.
I'll
And
tell you, JB, I was in LA 2 summers ago, summer of 2023. Steve Earle played a show at the Roxy, and in the middle of it, he said this thing about how um, we had reached this point where it wasn't just that people didn't but we were on separate teams. There was like red and blue, and you didn't see much crossing. But that people's attitudes increasingly was that they didn't, when they saw someone walking up the street or met someone who they knew on the basis of who they voted for, they knew would disagree with them about some fundamental thing, that their attitude was, I don't want to talk to that person because I already know we disagree. We're not going to be able to make any headway. And he said that is when democracy dies, is when people just start to look on the basis of the color of the jersey you're wearing. You're not going to have the conversation. That's the end of persuasion. And when persuasion goes away, you have a big problem with keeping the democracy going.
I agree. John, thank you so much. It's really nice to meet you, and thank you for spending your time with us. I look forward to seeing you and continue the dialogue.
Happy to do it, man. We'll see you next time I'm in LA. We'll have a meal.
Sounds good. Thanks,
And
John.
nice to have all the rest of you guys. Thanks for everybody for listening to all this jabber.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.